Wow, okay. You weren't kidding when you said you were diving deep into human behavior. This is a lot.
Well, to really understand anything, sometimes you got to look at it from all angles.
Right. And you've definitely given us a lot of angles. I mean, we've got videos on the Milgram experiment, the Stanford prison experiment, there's behavioral economics, rational choice theory. We've even got a glimpse into a Harvard Business School classroom with a case study about the Me Too movement. Oh, and cultural relativism. And something about the scientific method and exponential growth. Where did you even find all this?
Hmm. The internet's a big place.
That's for sure. But seriously, there's some heavy stuff here. You must be trying to get to the bottom of some big questions about how people make decisions, especially in those tough, ethically complex situations. Like, what makes us tick?
I think that's a question we all grapple with, right?
Absolutely. And that's what we're here for. We're going to try to make sense of all this together, pull out the most interesting bits, and hopefully give you, the listener, some food for thought. So, where should we start? What caught your eye first in this massive pile of info?
Well, that Harvard Business School case study class video, let's just say, they don't mess around. Jumping right into the fire with the Me Too movement, as an example.
Oh yeah, talk about trial by fire. I felt the tension through the screen. That professor, he just throws this complex real-world ethical dilemma at his students, and it's like, go, figure it out.
It's a really interesting teaching method, though, don't you think? It's all about thinking on your feet, making decisions under pressure,
Yeah.
kind of like real life, right?
Totally. And I like how he emphasized that there's not always a right answer. It's more about navigating those gray areas and, weighing those potential consequences.
Exactly. Which is, I think, a big part of what you're trying to explore with all these sources.
For sure. But what about the professor giving away copies of his book? That seemed like more than just a nice gesture.
Good catch. It's a subtle way of highlighting those inherent power dynamics in any learning environment.
Mhm.
He's the expert, he has the knowledge, and that little act reinforces his position.
Subtle but powerful. Okay, so we've seen how the elite learn, but what about how we all actually make decisions? That behavioral economics video you sent, I think it's going to challenge some assumptions.
Oh, absolutely. Prepare to have your mind blown. It completely dismantles that classic economic idea of humans as perfectly rational actors.
Wait, so we're not just walking calculators, always making the most logical choice?
Not quite. It introduces this concept of bounded rationality. Basically, even simple choices, like picking a flavor of ice cream, are limited by the information we have, our past experiences, even our mood at that moment.
Okay, that makes a lot more sense. I mean, I know I don't always make the most rational decision when I'm staring into the freezer. It's more like, ooh, chocolate sounds good right now.
Right. And they give this great example in the video. Remember that experiment where people enjoyed the same wine more when they thought it was expensive?
Yeah. It shows just how easily our perceptions can be manipulated. It makes you think about all those marketing tricks companies use, and maybe even those animal spirits that drive those crazy financial bubbles. Maybe we're not as in control of our choices as we think we are, so maybe we're not as in control of our choices as we think we are. Now, from wine to something a little more shocking, the Milgram experiment. It's terrifying how easily ordinary people were willing to inflict pain on others simply because a figure of authority told them to.
It really is a chilling study. The Milgram experiment is a stark reminder of how susceptible we are to authority, even when it clashes with our own sense of morality.
Yeah.
It makes you wonder, how much of what we do is driven by obedience, even when it feels wrong.
Right. And it's interesting. You also sent some stuff about cultural relativism. The idea that what's considered right or wrong can be totally different depending on the culture you're in.
Exactly. It challenges this idea of universal moral truths, like what we might see as totally unacceptable here could be perfectly normal somewhere else. It makes you think how much of what we believe is truly ours and how much is just shaped by the society we grew up in.
That's a deep thought. So we've got our own biases. We're swayed by authority. Our culture shapes our values. Now let's throw another theory into the mix. Rational choice exchange theory. This one says social interactions are all about maximizing personal rewards, like a kid being good to get a cookie.
Well, the kid and cookie thing, that's a simplified way of looking at it. But the theory basically argues that in social interactions, we're all trying to get the best deal for ourselves, maximize our rewards and minimize our costs.
Makes sense on the surface. But honestly, do we always make the most rational choices? I mean, I'm looking at this bag of ramen noodles I'm about to eat, and but let's just say it's not the healthiest choice.
Right. And what about those times when people act altruistically, even risking their own well-being for others. How does that fit into the whole maximizing rewards idea? It seems like there's more to the story than just cold, hard calculations.
Definitely. This brings us to an experiment that's both fascinating and deeply disturbing. The Stanford prison experiment. It's become a classic example of how good people can turn bad when put in the wrong environment.
It's a powerful illustration of how situations can influence our behavior. But you know what? There's more to the story. You sent a journalist's investigation and a personal account from one of the bad guards, Dave Eshelman. Turns out it might not be as clear-cut as we thought.
Oh yeah, this is where things get really interesting. These new accounts bring in this idea of demand characteristics. Basically, the participants might have been acting the way they did because they felt pressured to meet the researchers' expectations, not necessarily because they were inherently bad.
Exactly. It challenges the whole situation makes you evil narrative. So are we shaped more by our inherent nature or by external pressures? It's a question that researchers are still grappling with. And you know what? It links back to the Milgram experiment, too. It seems like authority figures and perceived expectations play a huge role in how we behave. Maybe we're not as autonomous as we like to think.
Okay, so we've got this swirling mix of internal factors, external pressures, ethical dilemmas, and it feels like every answer just leads to more questions. But before we get too lost in the Stanford prison experiment, there's another experiment you sent that tries to address these same big questions, but with a twist. This one comes from a guy with a YouTube channel.
Ah, yes. Michael Stevens and his attempt to recreate the Stanford prison experiment, but with some major changes, he tried to take those ethical considerations into account and design a more, shall we say, humane version of the experiment.
He basically flipped the script. Let's break down what he did and what it means for our understanding of human behavior.
So Stevens really wanted to create a more ethical experiment, address some of those criticisms of the original Stanford prison experiment. So he handpicked participants who were known for being, like, really good people.
Yeah.
High moral standards. And he didn't tell them to be cruel or anything. In fact, he even got rid of the other team altogether.
It's like he was trying to stack the deck against the whole power corrupts idea. Like, okay, if people are inherently bad, surely this will bring it out.
Yeah, exactly. It's like he set up this super ethical prison, almost like a utopia. But here's the thing. It didn't turn into a Lord of the Flies situation at all. The first group, even with anonymity and power, they didn't become tyrannical. They just chatted, they formed bonds, they even worried about the well-being of the other team, which, remember, didn't actually exist.
They basically had a virtual slumber party instead of turning into those ruthless guards.
That's wild. It really challenges that whole narrative from the Stanford prison experiment. Right. But then Stevens throws in this interesting twist with the second group. He tells them that their task is to buzz the other team. Just, press a button.
Wait, so even though they knew the buzzing wasn't actually doing anything, just a meaningless button press, they became way more active. That's kind of strange, right?
Yeah, it is. But it seems like framing the buzzing as a task, as something they were expected to do, was enough to change their behaviors. Like that simple instruction, that shift in perception, made a huge difference. So maybe it's not just about the situation, but also about the roles we're given and how we interpret those expectations.
That's a good point. So we're not just shaped by the environment, but also by how we perceive our role in that environment. This is getting really complex. I mean, it seems like Stevens' experiment throws a big wrench in that whole situation makes you evil idea. Individual personality and the perception of what's expected of us, those seem to play a bigger role than we might think.
Absolutely. And, it connects back to what we were saying about the Milgram experiment in that Harvard Business School class. There's this constant interplay between individual factors, social pressures, authority figures, and the situations we find ourselves in. It's all tangled up together.
Yeah, totally. And it reminds me of that discussion in the case study class about the Me Too movement. They were talking about all those ethical gray areas and the challenges of navigating those situations in the workplace. It's like everything we've been talking about, but in a real world context.
Right. And the professor really pushed his students to think critically about their own biases, those unconscious assumptions we all carry around, and how those might influence our decisions.
And he brought up some really tough examples, like that company with the toxic bro culture and that executive who was afraid to mentor younger women because he was worried about being falsely accused.
Yeah, it's a tough situation. I mean, on the one hand, you can understand his fear, right? Nobody wants to be wrongly accused of something. But on the other hand, by not mentoring women, he could be unintentionally holding them back.
It's like a classic catch-22, and it shows just how complex these issues can be. There are no easy answers.
Exactly. And the discussion about the gender pay gap was really interesting, too. It's tempting to just say, well, it's just because men have more experience, but the professor really challenged that assumption. He made us think about those systemic factors, like unconscious bias in hiring and promotion practices.
And what about the fact that women are often the ones who take time off for family caregiving? That can definitely impact their careers and earning potentials. Like all these things are intertwined: gender roles, social expectations, economic structures. It's not just about individual choices.
Right. It's about those larger systems that shape those choices and how those systems often perpetuate inequality. And that's why it's so important to be aware of those systemic factors, those hidden forces that are operating beneath the surface.
It's like we're peeling back layers of an onion, and each layer reveals more complexity. But before we get too deep into the weeds here, I want to bring up something you sent that I wasn't sure how to connect to all of this at first. It's that excerpt on the scientific method and exponential growth.
Ah, yes. That might seem like an odd fit with all this psychology stuff, but it's actually really relevant. Think about it. As technology advances, and it's happening at an accelerating rate, our ability to influence others grows exponentially.
Okay, I'm starting to see the connection. So the ethical dilemmas we've been discussing, they're not just about individual actions anymore. We're talking about systems and technologies that can amplify those actions on a massive scale.
Exactly.
Uh-huh.
Social media algorithms, artificial intelligence, the spread of misinformation. These are all tools that can be used to manipulate our perceptions and influence our behavior in ways that we're only just beginning to understand.
It's almost like we're conducting a giant experiment on ourselves, and the stakes are higher than ever before, which makes understanding human behavior, all those biases and vulnerabilities and social pressures, even more crucial. If we don't understand how our minds work, how we make decisions, how we're influenced, then we're just pawns in someone else's game.
That's a powerful image, and it's so true. We need to be aware, we need to be critical, we need to be proactive. We can't just sit back and let others shape our world for us. We have to be active participants in shaping our own destiny.
Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground here, from those classic experiments to those modern theories, from the halls of Harvard Business School to the depths of the internet. We've explored the fascinating and often unsettling world of human behavior. But what does it all mean for you, the listener? Why should you care about all these experiments and theories?
Because understanding human behavior isn't just an academic exercise. It's about understanding yourself, your own motivations, your own biases, your own susceptibility to influence. It's about making better decisions, building stronger relationships, navigating this complex world we live in.
It's about being a more informed, more aware, and ultimately more empowered individual.
Right,
Yeah.
exactly. And it's not just about individual growth. It's about understanding the forces that shape our societies, our institutions, our world. It's about recognizing those patterns of behavior, both good and bad, that lead to conflict, to inequality, to injustice.
So it's not just about psychology, it's about sociology, politics, economics. It's about understanding how systems can be designed to either exploit our weaknesses or empower us to make better choices. It's about recognizing that we're not just passive observers in this grand experiment of human behavior. We're active participants, and the choices we make, both individually and collectively, have real consequences.
And those choices are more important than ever before as we face a future shaped by rapid technological advancements, social upheaval, and unprecedented ethical challenges. The more we understand about ourselves and each other, the better equipped we'll be to navigate those turbulent waters and create a future that is both just and sustainable.
So what's the takeaway here? What can our listener do with all this information?
Cultivate a sense of curiosity. Be willing to question assumptions. Don't take things at face value. Dig deeper, ask why, and remember, there's always more to learn.
And don't be afraid to challenge the status quo. Whether it's a business practice, a social norm, or even your own deeply held belief, critical thinking is a muscle that needs to be exercised regularly.
We've seen how even good people can be swayed by situational factors, by authority figures, by those pressures of conformity. But we've also seen examples of individuals who resisted those pressures, who stood up for what they believed in, who made choices that aligned with their values.
So it's not just about understanding the forces that shape our behavior, it's about recognizing our own agency, our ability to choose, to act, to make a difference.
And that brings us right back to the heart of your research. This quest to understand human behavior, not just as a set of predictable patterns, but as this dynamic interplay of individual choice, social influence, and situational context. It's messy, it's complex, and it's constantly evolving.
But it's also incredibly fascinating, wouldn't you say?
Absolutely. And the more we learn about ourselves and each other, the better equipped we'll be to face those challenges and opportunities that lie ahead.
Well, I don't know about you, but this deep dive has definitely given me a lot to think about. I'm feeling both inspired and a little terrified at the same time.
Yeah.
It's a lot to process.
That's the beauty of knowledge, isn't it? It expands our horizons, challenges our assumptions, and ultimately empowers us to make more informed choices. And speaking of choices, remember that professor at Harvard Business School? The one putting his students on the spot with those real-world ethical dilemmas. He wasn't just teaching them about business, he was teaching them about life.
He was preparing them to be leaders, to make decisions that would impact the lives of others. And it's not just business leaders who face those kinds of choices, right? We all do, every single day.
Every interaction we have, every decision we make, has the potential to ripple outwards, to create change.
So it's not just about understanding human behavior, it's about taking responsibility for our own actions and striving to make choices that align with our values, even when it's hard, even when it's uncomfortable.
And sometimes it's about recognizing that we don't have all the answers, that there are gray areas, and that the right decision isn't always clear.
It's about being willing to have those tough conversations, to grapple with that complexity, and to acknowledge that even our best intentions can sometimes lead to unintended consequences.
And it's important to remember that we're not alone in this. There are so many people out there working to make the world a better place, to create positive change, by staying informed, by engaging in those constructive dialogues, by supporting those initiatives that align with our values. We can all be part of that movement towards a more just, equitable, and sustainable future.
So before we wrap up this deep dive, I want to ask you, the listener, a question. What resonates with you the most from everything we've talked about today? What's one thing you're going to take away from this conversation and try to apply to your own life?
Maybe it's being more mindful of your own biases. Maybe it's speaking up when you see injustice happening. Maybe it's just being a little kinder, a little more compassionate in your interactions with others.
Whatever it is, remember that you have the power to choose, the power to act, the power to make a difference. Even small actions can have that ripple effect.
And that's a powerful thought, isn't it? We're not just pawns in someone else's game. We're active players, and we have the ability to shape our own lives and the world around us.
So as you go about your day, remember this. Be curious, be critical, be compassionate, and most importantly, be the change you want to see in the world. At the beginning, we were talking about cracking the code of human behavior, and it turns out there's no code. It's not that simple.
Nope, not at all. Human behavior. It's not a simple formula you can just plug into. It's like this crazy mix of individual quirks and social pressures all playing out in different situations.
Right.
And even those classic experiments like we've seen, they don't always tell the whole story.
Right. Like we've been looking at all these maps of human behavior, but the map is never the same as the real territory. You know what I mean?
That's a great way to put it. We could try to simplify things, create models and theories, but human behavior, it's always going to be messier and more complex than any map we can draw.
Exactly. So where do we go from here? We've learned so much and covered all these biases and influences and contradictions, but honestly, it's a bit overwhelming. How do we actually use this knowledge in our own lives?
Well, I think the first step is just being aware. Recognizing that these forces are at play. It's like shining a light on those unconscious processes that drive our decisions. Once we see them, we can start to question them.
Yeah, and maybe even change them, right? If we realize we're being swayed by something we don't agree with, we can try to course correct.
Exactly. And that's where critical thinking comes in. Don't just accept things at face value. Dig deeper. Ask questions. Especially these days, with all the information overload, we've got to be able to filter through the noise and make our own judgment.
Oh, for sure. It's like a constant bombardment of news and opinions and ads, all trying to influence us. If we don't think critically, we're just letting ourselves be manipulated.
Absolutely. And don't be afraid to challenge the status quo, even your own beliefs. That's how we learn and grow.
Okay, so awareness, critical thinking, those are key. But what about action? How do we actually make a difference, both in our own lives and in the world around us?
Well, start by paying attention to the choices you make. Even small decisions can have ripple effects. You know, that butterfly effect. A tiny change here can lead to big consequences over there.
Whoa, yeah, I can see how that applies to human behavior too. Like every interaction, every choice, it's all connected.
It really is. So Next time you're facing a decision, take a moment. Think about those potential consequences. Ask yourself, am I acting in line with my values? Am I making the world a better place even in a small way?
It's about being intentional, even in those everyday moments. And sometimes it means taking a stand, even when it's hard.
Remember those people in the Milgram experiment who refused to keep going? They showed us that it's possible to resist those pressures, to stand up for what's right.
And those Harvard Business School students, they're being groomed to be leaders. The choices they make are going to have a big impact. What kind of leaders will they be? What kind of world will they create? It's kind of scary to think about.
It is, but it's not just about those in positions of power. We all have the ability to make a difference. We can choose to be kind, to be just, to stand up for what we believe in.
We can choose to support those who are fighting for a better world. We don't have to feel powerless.
Exactly. Let's not be overwhelmed by all this complexity. Let's be inspired by it. Let's use this knowledge to empower ourselves and each other.
So, to wrap things up, I want to leave you, the listener, with a question. What's resonating with you the most from everything we've talked about? What's one thing you're going to take away from this?
Maybe it's being more aware of your own biases. Maybe it's having those tough conversations about injustice. Or maybe it's just choosing to be a little kinder, a little more understanding in your everyday interactions.
Whatever it is, remember, you have the power to choose. You have the power to act. You have the power to make a difference.
And those ripples, those little acts of kindness, of courage, of awareness, they can spread further than we imagine.
So be curious, be critical, be compassionate, and most importantly, be the change you want to see in the world. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive.